So welcome everybody. To get started with this week's lecture, I just want to talk a little bit about the upcoming deliverables. The biggest deliverable you have coming up is the final proposal, or the final research proposal that you'll be working on. And so you've already should have completed the proposal draft, and now it's time for you to actually complete the proposal. So you should definitely take the feedback that you've received into consideration. One thing to also mention is that I will be looking at things much more harshly in the final deliverable compared to what you gave in the proposal. In the proposal, I was lenient on a lot of things like grammar, mistakes, some things that could have been clarified. Maybe got dinged only a few points on something. Whereas on the final submission, you'll be dinged much harder for those things. Especially if I made a comment in your proposal and you end up not fixing it, you're gonna get dinged reasonably harshly. So make sure you pay appropriate attention to any comments that I made in your proposal draft. If for some reason you're working on a project and you decide that you want to change topics, talk to me. I'd rather see you moving towards a new topic rather than to continue working on an old topic. And really just to keep working on things and do a final research proposal submission on a topic that you know you're not going to work on. So if at some point you decide that you want to change topics, just let me know. And that's something we can discuss and we can come up with a plan for moving forward. Like I've said probably 1,000 times and you're sick of me saying this, the goal of this class is to get you ready to start your thesis or capstone. And if you're working on a project that you know is dead, it's not doing you any good. So make sure you're working on your proposal. Make sure you're working on a topic that does suit you. Your final submission will take you longer than you think it will take you. If you're doing a good job, it should be almost like finishing up a programming assignment. You think you're done, you think you're pretty close to done, and then you realize that you have more work to do. So spend a lot of time on things like with previous submissions. Make sure it's an ACM or IEEE format. And I think that's about it for your research proposal submission. And for the research poster, you could definitely take a look on the course website under resources and under poster information. There's some good guidelines that you can follow. For this course, you do not need to create an actual poster as far as like printing one out, but what you are expected to do is to have like a 2 to 5 minute presentation, screencast presentation on a poster that you create, and then you'll be uploading that to the final Dropbox for the poster presentation. But definitely take a look at the poster information page in the resources page of the course website. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is experimental design. So we've talked, the topics we're going to talk about today, we've covered at least a little bit in some of the previous weeks. I know some of the slides are going to be a review for what we covered in some of the previous weeks. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is very important for setting up good experiments for your study. And I want to give some tips as far as hurdles that you may encounter and in some ways to overcome those hurdles. So most projects you're going to work on will have experiments in some shape or form. In fact, I have a hard time coming up with a project that will not have an experiment. And the project you're going to be doing, whether or not it's a thesis or capstone, is no different. In some way, shape, or form, you're probably going to have an experiment. Now, this experiment could involve you doing a human study. It could involve you running a set of tools on some GitHub code. Whatever it is, you're probably going to run different types of experiments. And how you design your experiment largely defines your success. Even the best research questions, even the best hypothesis, if you don't design your experiment well, you're going to waste your time. So design an experiment well defines the success for your project in many, many ways. And it designs it because it will give you the proper results. It's going to give confidence in your work to others. So if somebody looks at your work and they see you have a good experiment, you follow things appropriately, you conducted actions appropriately, that's going to provide the reader a lot of confidence that your work is good. But at the end of the day, your work must also be repeatable. So that's why it's important to set up a good experiment, have good experimental design in your work. Bad experiments very frequently lead to bad or untrusted data, and that's waste. I've personally worked on a lot of projects where I had a bad experimental design. I did a lot of work running the experiment. I did a lot of work analyzing the data, only to have reviewers come back and say, hey, your experiment was bad. So then I have to go back through and rerun the experiment. And I may have wasted 100 to 200 to 300 hours on that work because I had a bad experiment. So, like a couple of things we've talked about in the course, it's like having a good foundation. You want to make sure you have a good experiment because if you have a bad experiment, very likely all the work you do after that is going to turn into waste. So, some tips for designing good experiments for your work is to think it through before you actually run through the experiment. So, think about what your end results are going to look like and if those end results will match your goals, if they'll match what you want to find. Now, your experiment may not give you the actual results you want to get, but what I mean is, will it match the format of the data that you want to receive? And will it do a good job answering your research questions? Some other tips are to plan for variability. Think about the data in your experiment that you'll need and not need. And so that'll actually drive how you actually create your experiment, because if you have unneeded data, that could not only be waste, but that could also impact your results. And so know what experiment to run, and when in doubt, ask. So this is something your advisor is going to have a lot of experience in. So when it comes time to run your experiment, do not be afraid to ask your advisor. Do not be afraid to ask anyone else, because they can definitely help you with setting up your experiment. So when setting up your experiment, you are going to really come up with a lot of different types of hypotheses, and one of the areas I want to talk about is establishing a cause and effect relationship. Now, as we talk about this, I think it's kind of interesting because as you turn on the news and you hear about different studies, or if you get into the political garbage in the United States, you're going to hear a lot of things about like cause and effect. And sometimes people try to create cause and effect relationships when in fact they shouldn't be. In establishing cause and effects, you'll also look at correlations inside that cause and effect. So one way to demonstrate validity to your study and your experimental design is through a correlation. So maybe you come up with a research question if you should drink coffee. And then your question could be, is there a correlation with how much coffee I drink and how happy I am? So maybe you'd look at things and you'd say, all right, I'm going to chart the amount of coffee I drink in one day and then correlate that to how happy I am in one day. So you create a chart with that and you look to see if there's a correlation. And that could potentially help drive a cause and effect relationship. So one problem with setting up something like that is this. If you were to say that the temperature is always 40 when it snows, you could create you would find the correlation that it only snows when it's under 40 degrees, right? So very, very rarely could it snow if it was above 40. Frankly, I don't know if that's actually scientifically possible, but it's probably never going to happen, even in Rochester. And so if you were to check the temperature for the days it snowed, it's probably going to be under 40 degrees. However, you can't say that whenever it's under 40 degrees, it's going to snow, because that's simply not true. So if you were to say that, you'd be creating a correlation that doesn't exist. The correlation does exist. You'd be creating a causality, meaning something that caused something else that didn't exist. So if you were to say that whenever it's cold out, it snows, then you would creating a false or negative causation. And so you really want to be careful when you find correlations between items. So even if there's a correlation does not involve causation. So if we were to go back to our earlier example, maybe you were to check, maybe if you drink coffee every day and then you measured the days you're happy, you couldn't then say, well, I'm only happy because I drink coffee. Maybe that's true for us, I don't know, but you couldn't create that causation in there. One correlation that does exist in the real world is a correlation between drinking coffee and the likelihood of having a heart attack. So I think a lot of times, especially when you're reading about health, you read about different correlations that take place. I know there's a lot of correlations between like drinking coffee and people have heart attacks. I know there's all kinds of correlation between like eating eggs and having heart attacks and things. And it's one of those things that seems to change every week whether or not it's good or bad for you to do. But one correlation that does exist is that there is a correlation between people who drink coffee and the likelihood of having a heart attack. Now, don't worry, what I'm going to show you from the next slide doesn't mean that you should not drink coffee ever. So you shouldn't conclude that drinking coffee causes heart attacks, because there are different external factors in play. So, for example, cigarette smoking is related to both of these variables. So, just by, I don't know if it's the luck of it or whatever, people who smoke cigarettes generally smoke coffee. Or, generally drink coffee. And then people who smoke cigarettes have a higher likelihood of having a heart attack. Now, there is also the fact that individuals who drink little coffee are less likely to smoke than people who drink a lot of coffee. So what that means is people who generally drink more coffee are generally more likely to smoke. And smoking does have a correlation between whether or not you smoke and whether or not you have a heart attack. So in really the end of the day, there is a correlation between coffee and smoking, and there's a correlation between smoking and heart attacks. But really, it's just it implies that if you drink a lot of coffee, if you smoke, you're likely to drink a lot of coffee. And so, really, at the end of the day, even though there is a correlation or relationship between people who drink coffee and the people likely of having a heart attack, it's really more tied into the fact that people who drink a lot of coffee are likely to smoke, and then smoking is the thing that leads to heart attacks. So you really want to be careful whenever you find a correlation, that you just don't assume that there's a causation there. You really want to think about looking into things deeper in your experiments. And so that's why it's important to think about these possible correlations when setting up your experiments. But when you do find a correlation in your experiment, don't just assume that there is a causation. If you think back to a couple weeks back when we talked about things like a correlation between, I don't know, the number of Nicolas Cage films and the amount of suicides, even though there's a correlation, it doesn't imply causation between those items. So that's something you want to be careful of. And so, in talking about correlations, one thing that we talked about a couple weeks back is correlations and relationships between variables. And just to kind of recap things, the relationships can be strong or weak, and they can be positive or negative. So the strongest perfect positive correlation is a +1, so it can never be larger than +1. And the strongest perfect negative correlation is -1. And if you were to say that there's a perfect no correlation between items, that would be 0, and a weak positive correlation is generally assumed to be 0.2, and a weak negative correlation is generally assumed to be -0.2. And I think I've seen like medium length correlations being like 0.6 or 0.7 between items. You could still say that they're pretty strong, but they're not as perfect as a +1 or -1. So I just wanted to do a short recap on correlations. So the next couple slides I want to talk about is talking about determining information, or really selecting information or selecting processes for your study. And just to show an example of how bad people are in actually selecting information or selecting sample information. Let's do a short experiment. So if this was a classroom of 20 people, I'd be asking everybody in the classroom to do this study. So let's just do an experiment to see how well everybody is selecting random numbers. So take a second and select a number select either a number of 1, 2, 3, or 4. So in your head, just think about the number 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay. So I'm guessing that you either selected 2 or 3 from that random number list. Statistically speaking, people are much more likely to select 2 or 3 from that list of values. In the past, when I've done this experiment in a classroom of like 20 people, like 7 or 8 people each selected 2 and 3, and the rest selected 1 and 4. So people are very bad at selecting random information, and I'm doing saying random right now with air quotes. So in your study, you need to be in your study experiment. Whenever you're saying, hey, I selected random information, you need to be really careful of that. Or whenever you say you selected, I'll skip ahead a bit. Whenever you selected study apps, whenever you selected a process, you need to justify things. You need to have a reason why you did that. And I always say good reasons is if you can find a previous work that used that same process, maybe use that same set of apps, you can say I chose these apps because this other study used them, or I used this algorithm because like these other studies use them. Now you still need to back that up a bit, but it's a very good starting point to cite somebody else. If you can't find somebody else to cite, you need to justify things. One mistake I've made in the past is I've done studies where I would quote randomly select like 50 apps from Google Play, and reviewers would come back and say, "How did you randomly select those? What did you do? Just close your eyes and pick apps? Did you have a tool that did it?" And really, I got ripped apart for my process of quote randomly selecting apps. So moving forward, what I would do in studies is I would say I'm using the same apps that these other papers have used, or maybe I'm choosing the top 50 Google Play apps, or I'd have some reason for choosing the apps that I did. And so you want to make sure you do the same thing. Other things that you can do is to actually use a random generator to select something, or use a different process for selecting something that you do. Okay. So the last couple things I want to talk about is this idea of internal and external validity. And so internal validity is really the cause of things. External validity will generalize things, and construct or measure is measure what should be measured. And so these are some good steps for measuring validity. But for internal validity, in a nutshell, you can think about this: how well the study was actually run. And so, were there problems with the actual study? In external validity is the extent to which the study can be generalized or used in the outside world. So, a good example for internal validity might be as if I'm doing some kind of drug study to see if a certain drug cures cancer. Well, internal validity might include whether or not I made a mistake with the actual study. Maybe I did a calculation wrong. Maybe I didn't choose a good representative group. Something like that. Where external validity would be really how well that that study about the anti-cancer drug worked in the real world. And so I'll talk about external validity in a little bit. So sorry about that. So just hopping back, external validity. You can think of that as the extent of which a study's results can be generalized or applied to the real world. So, for an example, for external validity, maybe I'm doing a study if computers are cool. So I know this is a very bad research question. I know this is too general, but let's just assume I'm doing a study. Are computers cool? So I design this study and I conduct a really great survey. and with really great survey questions, and I performed this study at RIT. So since I had really great survey questions, and I could say I had really great internal validity. So let's say I do the study and I find computers are cool. So I could say I had a great internal validity. The study was set up fine, but there are some threats to external validity as well. So some samples to external validity or threats to see how this study actually applies to the real world and generalizes to the real world are a few. Some I have are I only ask the younger people. So college students are typically younger. And so I'm guessing that most college students are between the ages of 18 and 25. But most of the world is not of that age. So therefore, I didn't ask a good representative group. The second thing is most students at RIT are in an engineering or technology field, so therefore they're probably more techie than the average even 18 to 25-year-old. Therefore my results are skewed. So this study would represent a threat to external validity. So that's it for me for the week. So I guess that's it. So thanks everybody, and we'll chat next week. Bye bye.